Today we're going to be talking about actually reaching that decision maker, which is uncomfortable sometimes. Sometimes we feel like we're going to be going around someone. But there are reasons why we need to get the decision maker, not just because it's going to be more likely that we're going to actually close a decent deal, but also in terms of how we can best serve our clients, because a lot of times we find that they may have objectives that they need to reach, but it doesn't always line up with what the expectation is of leadership, or there are all types of other dynamics that happen here. Essentially, we have the fear of upsetting someone by going around them, and they have the fear of, what if I introduce them to my boss and it doesn't go well? A lot of times, in a lot of sales coaching and training and books that you'll read, will talk about trying to overcome the status quo. But a lot of times people are afraid of making the wrong decision, more afraid of making the wrong decision than they are of their own current status quo. And so testing their ability to decide is really testing their fear of making the wrong decision. And then how do we align our capabilities to that? And we talked a little bit about how telling details that give them quantifiable sort of capabilities, as when tying that to the needs that they have and the goals that they're trying to reach, helps to reduce that fear of making the wrong decision. And a lot of times that's why the majority of deals don't close, is because in our buyer's mind, they're not clear on how this is going to solve their problem and avoid any of the risks of it going wrong in the future. I gave the metaphor of investing in the stock market. It's something that we know that we need to do. However, for a lot of people, and I'm one of those people, is the volatility of the stock market makes them nervous. What if they invest in the wrong stocks and lose all of their money? It'd be better to have it in the bank earning a lower interest rate than have the risk of losing it altogether. And that's kind of what's happening in our buyer's mind when they're thinking about making a purchase decision or changing the way that they're doing things. So this week, we're going to be talking about the last part of our disqualification, which is getting to and reaching the economic decision maker. Now, just as a quick definition, the economic decision maker is not the person who says, I'm the one that makes the recommendation, or I'm the one who decides. You have to ask yourself the question, is this the person who signs the front of the check or the back of the check? If they're signing the front of the check, then they're the decision maker. If they're signing the back of the check and cashing it, that means that they need to get approval from someone else. So in today's session, what we're going to be talking about is who is an economic decision maker, which is the quick definition that I just gave you. But then we're also going to be talking about the who and how questions in order for us to get to, or an introduction to, that decision maker, or be willing to go around them and go directly to that person ourselves. Then we're going to talk about how do we reframe the objection of getting that introduction. Because a lot of times people will throw up at you, I make the decision, I make the recommendation, my boss doesn't want to get involved. But there are circumstances and situations that we need to get that person involved, because otherwise the decision is not going to happen, or they're going to try to sell you to their boss and not do a very good job of it because they're not you. And then finally, we're going to also then talk about some of the other ways to get to the economic decision maker outside of hoping for an introduction or trying to get an introduction from someone inside the company. So who is that economic decision maker? As I was saying, it is the internal decision maker that's within a company who makes the decisions on behalf of the company. So think C-suite. They're making decisions on behalf of the entire company, versus the external decision makers, who are individuals or organizations outside of the company who make decisions that might affect the company. For example, board members, consultants. If they're making decisions for the company, but they're not a part of the company, they still will be part of your decision maker outreach. Now, oftentimes, as I've said, you hear the person say, or you ask who's the ultimate person that makes this decision. More often than not, you hear I'm the one who makes the decision. I'm the one that makes the recommendation. It's up to me to decide. Not always the case, though. So how do we test whether or not this person is the actual decision maker? Because there are times that it will happen where someone is not necessarily in the C-suite, but they are the decision maker. For example, when I'm working with clients, there's a VP of sales. And sometimes that VP of sales has what they call P&L responsibility. In other words, they're responsible for the numbers that are on the spreadsheet and are therefore given that ultimate budget making and decision making capability. But not all VPs of sales actually act as someone who is influencing that P&L statement, and instead are given a budget and told that they have to work within these parameters. And anything outside of that, they need to get permission for. So there's a slight nuance that happens there in deciding who is our ultimate decision maker, which is why we need to be prepared to ask a couple of questions to test that whether or not they are the decision maker. Who makes these types of decisions in your organization? Now, if you get I'm the one that makes these types of decisions, we need to go deeper and start asking them questions of, well, then who else do you need to go to in order to get this approved? So it's one way of not saying to them, I don't believe you that you're the decision maker, but instead asking another drill down question of what happens once you've made the decision that this is something that you want to do? What are your next steps? Who do you then need to go and talk to? Maybe it is the board. Maybe it is the CEO. And even though they decide, quote unquote, they still have to get the ultimate approval from someone else. Another question is, once you've identified if there are other people that get involved in this, for example, even sometimes CEOs are not the ultimate decision maker because they have a board that they have to go and report to. And in that case, we can ask questions about how do we get the board involved in this conversation? Not always an easy thing to do, but it does sometimes happen. Also, you may find that there are investors who are ultimate decision makers for CEOs. I work with a lot of startup companies where the founder, even though they're technically the CEO, still needs to get it approved by their by their investors or by their board. Another drill down question by asking who makes these types of decisions is what's important to them. Now, this is an important question to ask for a number of reasons. One, it's important to understand if you're not able to actually get in front of that decision maker, to know what's important to them. For example, a couple of years ago, I was working with a large digital marketing agency who had a CEO, and that CEO wasn't only the only decision maker because he had 4 other partners, which were all equal partners that all had an equal say. But we couldn't get all 4 of them on the call at the same time. We got 2 of them on the call. And so what I did was ask, all right, so for your other 2 partners who may have a different perspective on this, what are some of the questions they typically ask? What's important to them? And when they were able to answer those questions for me, what I did was actually created a customized video for those each one of those other partners or decision makers as I went through the proposal deck and explained to them the parts of it that were going to be important to them and address the questions that were going to be important to them. That video closed the deal for me, but only because I asked those questions. Otherwise, I would have had to try and scramble to try to get those people on the phone. They maybe have gotten some information from someone else who was in the meeting, and it's like the telephone game where it gets translated differently from one person to the next. But because I was able to find a way to speak to them directly and get their questions answered, not only did they feel included in it, but it was also relevant to them. And so the next question that we talked about last week in building out the decision requirements was, how do these decisions typically get made? What are the steps in the process? For example, in my book, I wrote about John, who owned a technology company and was trying to hire better salespeople. And so when I asked him the questions, what are the steps that they need to go through when they make these decisions? He had to go in front of his board. And the board wasn't willing to let anybody from the outside in, i.e. me. And so I had to be able to help him to understand what are the steps and things that he needs to go through in order to present this to the board. One of those questions is, what's the criteria that the board uses to decide when these kinds of decisions come up? Is it return on investment? Is it overall price? Is it time to value? There's a lot of different criteria that they might be using for that. By knowing what he was going to have to defend or talk about in that board meeting, I could provide him with that kind of material and information so that he could answer those types of questions. Another question for this: what are the steps that they need to go through? With John's example, when John said, I need to take this to the board, my next question was, well, once you take it to the board, then what are the steps that you need to go through? There needed to be a budget approval process. There needed to be legal that needed to get involved to sign up on the contracts. We needed to get HR involved because we were dealing with hiring situations and procedures. And so even though I still had the ultimate decision maker, who was the president of the company, he still had to answer to a board. He still had to answer to his HR people. And so there may be multiple decision makers that have some say in this. They may not be able to say yes, but they might be able to say no, which will hold up the deal or cause things to delay. Another question here is, how long does this entire process typically take? This question is important because as you're trying to reach your decision maker or talking with your decision maker, understanding each of the steps that they need to take, using John as an example, he needed to go to the board. After he went to the board, he needed to go to legal. Then he needed to go to HR. How long does that typically take? What are the milestones and dates for that? And the other reason that this question is important is if they want to see results in 6 months and their buying process takes 3 months, and it's going to take us 2 months to get it implemented and up and running, 1 month is not enough time for them to see the results that they needed to see. And so we either need to accelerate the purchase process, or we need to get a longer timeline for them to be able to see the results. What this really is all about is, again, setting the proper expectations of what's going to happen next, how it's going to happen, and who needs to get involved at each of those stages. Without that, what we end up doing is sending those follow-up emails that we all hate to send of, have you reviewed the proposal yet? Should we get on a call to talk? Blah, 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 blah. It's happened to me. Sometimes it still happens. But by going through these steps and these questions to reach that economic decision maker, we can reduce the amount of friction that's going to happen in the end of the sales cycle and into the purchasing process.